Central Yharnam. The terrific introduction to the world of Bloodborne packs an immediate punch with its striking visual style, its memorable enemy encounters, and its sprawling, interconnected design. For my money, it's one of the strongest levels in the entire game, setting a standard that all subsequent areas attempt to match, as well as successfully introducing the key components of the Bloodborne formula. For players who want to dive deeper, Central Yharnam also provides some rich lore that sheds light on Bloodborne's persistently unfortunate world, highlighting its hopeless citizens hunkered down in their homes as they wait for the hunt to conclude. Without a doubt, this is a level worthy of further analysis, but it's also an immensely complex level. Soon after starting the script for this video, I quickly realized two things. One, to comprehensively go over the full design of this entire area would be quite the undertaking. And two, if I was going to continue this series on Bloodborne's levels, I want to make sure that I'm actually providing some kind of interesting or entertaining commentary and don't get bogged down by the minutiae of every detail. Because of that, this video will be focusing on a broader, higher level look at the design of Central Yharnam, as well as pieces of it that I personally find interesting or noteworthy to discuss. The more intricate, step-by-step decisions required a different approach than that, so I've also recorded a full walkthrough of the level with commentary on a much more detailed scope. Part 1 of that walkthrough is complete, and I've uploaded it as a completely free video on my Patreon, so if this kind of stuff really interests you, go check that out. If the idea of a 10-minute video talking about things like why an enemy is placed in one corner instead of the other sounds incredibly boring to you, just hang out here. This is the level design of Bloodborne, Central Yharnam. Let's talk about first impressions. Central Yharnam does an exceptional job of introducing the player to the world of Yharnam and establishing from the onset what type of game we're dealing with. As we take our first steps to leave Yosefka's clinic, we're presented with a sliver of Yharnam's unique visual style in the form of this walled-off courtyard full of twisted trees, broken down stone pathways, and some ornate metalwork, some of it twisted and broken itself. There are gates to either side of our character, one locked, one unlocked, and a single glowing item to our left, quicksilver bullets. A lot of them, in fact, letting the player know that this is an item that should be used liberally, at least by Soulsborne standards. As eerie as this courtyard is, it does serve as almost a peaceful calm before the storm, as this is effectively the last time you'll be safe in the waking world of Yharnam for quite some time, because the unlocked gate leading out of this area gives us access to Central Yharnam, and it's here we get our first glimpse of Bloodborne's true identity. I'm going to pause on this shot right here, because this is the work of a team that knows exactly how to utilize the entrance to a level to set up its entire premise in a single frame. The first thing likely to catch your eye is the unmistakable reddish-orange sky framed under the archway of a massive bridge directly ahead. Though we don't know it at the time, the color of this sky and in turn the time of day will end up playing a large role in the events that take place throughout this night of our hunt. This pop of color amidst an otherwise gray environment, combined with the generous amount of brightness and lighting overall, help to establish a world that is decidedly depressing, but one that doesn't solely rely on darkness to achieve this effect. In fact, it's an odd color palette, one that maybe shouldn't work as well as it does, and though I've since become accustomed to it, I can distinctly remember entering this area for the first time and feeling as if this visual choice was strangely disorienting in a way. I'd be curious to hear if anyone else remembers a similar feeling. The bridge that frames this shot is also a notable feature here, prominently showcasing the grand architectural style found throughout Yharnam, as well as giving the player a preview of the area's scale. As we'll soon see, Central Yharnam is quite a sprawling level, spanning streets and alleyways, canals and homes, plazas and bridges, including the one we see in this entrance shot. But while this bridge is presented to us as a potential destination, it's also very clearly a significant distance away, letting us know that we'll no doubt have some ground to cover before arriving there. Other visual assets like the coffins and abandoned carriages behind us set the scene of a city that's undoubtedly experiencing a very bleak period in its history, a grim detail that distinctly contrasts with the grandiose architecture surrounding us on all sides. Even the lonesome top hat sitting on the ground gives us a glimpse into the most important aspect of the entire game. The fashion! Nothing in this shot is accidental. There are details and points of interest everywhere that provide the player with information on the game's setting, tone, scale, and expectations. And it's a style of entrance that we'll see multiple times throughout the game, as variations of it are used in other areas like Hemwick Charnel Lane, the Fishing Hamlet, and Canehurst Castle. But since Central Yharnam is the first true level in the game, it was especially important that they got this one right, and I think they nailed it, resulting in a really well-crafted introduction to the area that's both emotionally impactful and effective at communicating information. As we continue on from this scene and make our way up the ramp, a locked gate on the right filters us to our first encounter with one of the residents of Yharnam. They are not friendly. The most intriguing aspect of this encounter is that this enemy is clearly a human, or close to it. Not only that, but they shout at us telling us to get away as they shake their torch in our direction. Away! Away! In fact, all of the mobs of villagers found throughout Central Yharnam attack and hunt you unprovoked, and some even call you a beast. But wait a minute, I thought I was the hunter. And now that you mention it, a lot of these villagers actually look a bit like beasts themselves. So it's really in this simple moment during our first enemy engagement we get our initial glimpse at the cloudy narrative that's slowly revealed throughout Bloodborne, and it sets in motion the endless questions the game will present as you try to piece it all together. This is one of the standout features of Central Yharnam. It does a fantastic job of introducing the player to the world and narrative of Bloodborne, not through exposition or cutscenes, but through environmental design and natural interactions throughout the level. These are the very things that make storytelling in games unique to other mediums, and while it certainly can be argued that FromSoft at times leans a little too heavily on these techniques, it's without a doubt used to great effect in Central Yharnam. Much has been said about the streets and side alleys that snake their way through Central Yharnam. It's throughout these areas we're introduced to the rest of the city's villagers, often found patrolling in groups, a behavior that's quite a bit different from other Souls-likes that are filled with enemies waiting for the player to engage with them. These patrols often force you to keep moving to avoid being ambushed, adding to the tension of exploration and in certain cases preventing you from playing the game a little too patiently. The winding design of Central Yharnam's streets take the player on a course through a variety of environment types, its broad boulevards leading to its side alleys, its intricate plazas blending with its residential districts. And this is without a doubt one of the level's design strengths. Players will likely be spending a significant amount of time in this level before moving on, and it's important to make sure they don't feel like they're stuck in one area without a sense of uncovering more of the world. The transitions from spaces and landmarks like the infamous bonfire scene, to the kennel area, to the lone mysterious residence you're able to enter all flow really well from one to the other, and make the level's streets and upper segments enjoyable to explore no matter which route you find yourself on. Now, of course, the entirety of Central Yharnam is not available for the player to explore from the onset, and that's because the level utilizes the overlapping, shortcut-centric design that has become synonymous with FromSoft games. In total, there are 4 locked shortcuts, 3 gates and 1 elevator, as well as a few hidden routes that can make traversal across this expansive space a lot easier. Most great FromSoft levels are peeled back over time, requiring deliberate mastery of combat encounters in order to access each new section that slowly folds back onto spaces you've already visited. Central Yharnam becomes a perfect poster child for this design philosophy due to its size, interconnectedness, and use of alternate routes. The introduction to the level is a highly linear path that's excellently disguised as something much more open-ended, thanks to several locked gates and use of open sightlines that provide glimpses of the rest of the level. Eventually, things do open up as you reach the main street, from which you can gain access to the side alleyways, the lower canals, and the great bridge overhead. There isn't a wrong way to explore here, and because all of these spaces are layered on top of one another and connected through a series of ladders and side paths, it's easy to get blissfully lost when stumbling from one section to the next. The Great Bridge, where we eventually discover the level's first boss encounter, is visually one of the standouts of the whole level, allowing the artists and designers to fully utilize the blood orange skybox haunting the player on all sides while also highlighting the lavish yet imposing architecture found throughout Yharnam. The alleyways snake along the main streets and provide access to a couple of key shortcuts that can cut down on run times to boss fights. You won't find any villagers on patrol in this area, but you will find some ferocious dogs and a couple of troll-like minions to practice your parry shots on. Though it's perhaps Central Yharnam's least interesting area that actually serves as its best design choice, because it's the lower canals and sewers that provide an extra layer of depth to an already densely packed level. Stumbling into the canal area of central Yharnam was the exact moment I realized there was a lot more to this level than it first lets on. As an experience, there isn't necessarily anything here that stands out as far as memorable landmarks, environmental features, or enemy encounters. Yet it proves to be a vitally important section of central Yharnam because of how it pieces the rest of the level together. With multiple ways to find the canals depending on how the player initially explores their surroundings, it's a segment that works wonders to enhance the interconnected, non-linear design of the overall level. On my first playthrough, I came across the canals through the side path that drops down from the Great Bridge, but realistically, finding the entrance near the dog kennels is just as likely, and whichever point you exit this area can provide even more options for new exploration. In fact, the existence of the canals probably sets an unfair precedent for the game's other mainline levels, most of which have their share of offshoots and subsections, but are far less intertwined than what we see in central Yharnam. As an introductory level, this can be a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, it really starts the game with a bang, demonstrating some of Bloodborne's more complex level design and layout considerations. The player slowly uncovers each layer over time, with the canals being the final piece of the puzzle that unlocks the satisfaction of truly learning central Yharnam's intricate layout. And making that choice for the game's first level can be a really powerful way to hook the player and make them want to continue playing. On the other hand, it sets a standard that most of these subsequent levels in Bloodborne don't end up reaching. While areas like the Cathedral Ward, the Unseen Village, and the Nightmare of Mensis are great for their own reasons, none of them quite match this particular aspect of central Yharnam's design. But if we use a musical analogy and look at Bloodborne as FromSoft's attempt at crafting a great album, kicking things off with central Yharnam is like starting the album with one of its hit singles, and I think this strategy largely works out in the game's favor. So while the streets and upper levels of central Yharnam introduce the player to the clever ways that Bloodborne's levels are connected, the underbelly of the canals are what kick this design into high gear, providing multiple pathways that turn Yharnam's introductory region into one large cohesive district. There are two bosses found in central Yharnam, the Cleric Beast and Father Gascoigne, and it's no accident that between the two of them, one is a beast and one is a hunter, as these largely end up being the two templates that most of Bloodborne's bosses stem from. The Cleric Beast is likely the first boss most players will encounter in the game, so it's important that it lays a foundation for what players can expect from these encounters moving forward. Bosses that take the form of beasts in Bloodborne are typically three things: large, aggressive, and hairy. They often rely on their size to engage with large, sweeping attacks intended to intimidate and overwhelm the player with their impact. The bridge on which the fight with the Cleric Beast takes place makes for a thrilling setting, if, that is, you manage to have a second to stop and take notice of it. The narrow lane created by this choice of setting does limit the player's horizontal movement a bit, but that also means that the beast's movement paths are limited largely to a single axis, making for a manageable introduction to bosses before fighting others that are given much more ground to move around in. Father Gascoigne, located near the end of central Yharnam's limits, is by design quite a different style of fight. Gascoigne is a hunter himself, just like you, except he's been overcome with bloodlust, causing some unfortunate side effects. And it's in this fight we see the second template for bosses and other elite enemies used in Bloodborne, and especially in its Old Hunters DLC. Hunters aren't mindless beasts that use fiercely aggressive attacks to overwhelm the player. They're tacticians that mirror many of the abilities the player has themselves, including dodging, parrying, and quick-striking combos. Fights with beasts often feel like a constant battle to narrowly avoid devastating attacks before closing in to dish out your own damage. Fights with hunters, then, feel more akin to a chess match that asks the player to monitor their foe's movements and pick the exact moments to counterattack. Both styles of fights add their own value, and both are introduced deliberately in the game's first level. In fact, even if you happen to miss the Cleric Beast on your way through central Yharnam, Father Gascoigne's second form makes sure you won't avoid the destructive nature of beast-like enemies for long. In addition to serving as introductions to the formula that many of Bloodborne's bosses utilize, these two fights also provide some insight into the fascinating and hopeless lore that covers Yharnam like a dense, predatory fog. Though the details of it all are difficult to untangle on a first playthrough, both the Cleric Beast and Father Gascoigne are a direct result of Yharnam's extraordinary blood discoveries and the destructive effects it can have when left unchecked. In many ways, Central Yharnam is a fantastic preparatory level, introducing the player to the world of Yharnam and some of the many dangers you'll encounter in it. But I think there are some aspects it struggles with, particularly with how it handles its unspoken tutorial-like obligations. The most obvious of these is how the game strangely handles the initial sequence of access to the Hunter's Dream and leveling your character. The first lamp you find in Central Yharnam gives the player the ability to transport back to the Hunter's Dream hub world, where they can upgrade weapons, purchase items, and of course use the blood echoes they've collected to level up their character. Except that's not actually the case during the initial segments of Central Yharnam, because although you have access to the Hunter's Dream, you don't have access to the doll that's responsible for leveling up and increasing stats. You're not told why you can't do this, you don't know how to unlock it, or where you go to do so. And so it turns out the doll will not awaken until you interact with your first boss. Sounds simple enough until you realize in order to find the cleric beast, you have to traverse about halfway through a level you've never seen before, with enemies you're not familiar with, in a layout you haven't mapped out yet. And this can be a hard sticking point for new players, because continually making runs through multiple groups of challenging enemies can feel like you're bashing your head against a wall dying over and over again during a time when a couple extra points of vitality could go a long way. This journey is made quite a bit worse by the infamous central bonfire scene, which presents no less than 13 enemies to a brand new player with 0 upgrades made to their character or weapons. You can run through the entire bonfire mob, and you likely will do that during subsequent runs back to other points of interest throughout the level. But even if you're familiar with other Souls games and know that this is an option, you're not meant to do that on your initial run through any area of any level. So if this is what the developers had in mind for this area, it runs antithetical to every other encounter in this series of games, because the intention is always to have you slowly work your way through these areas to learn their layouts and enemy placements, and to collect souls or blood echoes that you'll use to improve your character. So the player assumes they'll be able to do that here, but for some reason in Bloodborne, you can't, and it's odd. And I guarantee this single choice ended up turning off a lot of players, because not being able to progress due to challenging design is one thing, but being given no direction on why you can't progress, nor when you'll be able to, nor how to get to that point is a really tough pill to swallow. However, we all know that FromSoft oftentimes does not care about following the traditional playbook of game design, and in fact, this deliberate desire to push back on established standards is one of the studio's strongest assets. But there's one more piece of Central Yharnam during which I think tossing out that playbook ends up souring the experience a bit, and that's one particular design choice made for the boss battle with Father Gascoigne. Gascoigne's area is ridden with clusters of tombstones that impede your ability to move around with any sense of flow. It was a very odd choice to set the first major boss in the game in an environment that prevents the player from moving more freely and giving them chances to catch their bearings. It's so odd, in fact, that there's not a single other boss fight in Bloodborne that utilizes this type of deliberately impeding level geometry. I mean, it basically feels like trying to fight a Souls boss in the middle of a Bomberman level, which, oh my god, Souls-like Bomberman reboot? The counter-argument to this is that this environment forces the player to learn the mechanics of dodging and parrying that would make this phase of the fight more manageable. But the reality is that in any game, most players will default to the path of least resistance, particularly new players, and I'll remind you that we were all new players at this point in the game. And because this phase is pretty easy to cheese by circling around a cluster of gravestones and attacking through them, there's no doubt that this attempt to teach certain mechanics backfired for a very non-zero amount of players. Couple this with a second phase of the fight that features a highly aggressive beast form that can pounce on you anytime you attempt to retreat, and things here can get pretty frustrating for a new player. I think this fight can still be enjoyable, has a killer atmosphere and lore behind it, and becomes a lot more fun on subsequent playthroughs after you've mastered some of these mechanics. But as far as an introductory encounter that educates the player about bosses, it certainly has its failures. Fortunately, one of the masterful touches that FromSoft often accomplishes with its bosses is that there are almost always reasons to enjoy or appreciate them, even if you dislike the experience of the fight itself. The chilling atmosphere of their arenas, the story and lore behind their characters, the spectacle of their design and animations. Through both phases, I think Father Gascoigne is a great example of this, and is undoubtedly an encounter that still stands out among its peers. The third point is not a criticism of Central Yharnam's design itself, but more of how it sets up expectations for the rest of the game. And that's because, as alluded to before, the sprawling, interconnected design seen in this level isn't really ever executed again on the same scale. Even the Cathedral Ward, a vast and branching level that serves as Bloodborne's central node connecting to 5 other regions, doesn't contain the multi-leveled and layered design found in Central Yharnam. There are plenty of fantastic levels, both required and optional, found throughout the rest of Bloodborne, and many of them excel at specific aspects of design, sometimes even more so than Central Yharnam does. But it's not unreasonable to feel a little let down throughout the rest of the playthrough, knowing that this level's unique brand of interconnectivity is never replicated to the same degree. Fortunately, Bloodborne's overall superb design and memorable experiences will likely have you forgetting this is even the case. And despite the couple of gripes I have with Central Yharnam as an introductory area, I think this is truly one of the best regions in the entire game, and legitimately makes a case as one of the most intricately designed spaces across any genre and any era. After its initial level, Bloodborne will subsequently take the player on a thrilling journey through hidden realms, spooky villages, and the strange inner circles of its world, all of which contain their own secrets. But even through all of that, Central Yharnam will forever stand out as one of the game's most instantly recognizable and well-respected areas. And it will always be here in these streets underneath the eerie red-orange sky that the night of our hunt begins, time and time again. Hey, thanks for watching. This video is the second in a series that examines the level design of the many unique regions in Bloodborne, so if you haven't seen the first one, make sure to go check that out, and of course leave a comment here letting me know which Bloodborne level you'd like to see me tackle next. And again, part 1 of my walkthrough of Central Yharnam is available free to everyone over on my Patreon page. Check the link below to find that if you're interested, and here's a short preview of that video to give you an idea of its content. Now we learn the stairs continue to lead us down past 2 more enemies and onto the main thoroughfare of the level, but right as we're about to make our way onto that street, we see a group of enemies patrolling past. And oh look, another fork in the road. So here's another instance we're presented with a viable path blocked by a soft barrier, because we can choose to engage with this group, but that's likely not a great idea at this stage in the game. And even if we choose to wait for them to move past and follow closely behind them, we're soon presented with even more enemies in a scene that we'll get to discussing at a later point. So it's true that there's nothing physically preventing us from moving in this direction, but due to the threat posed by the overwhelming number of enemies, the more likely reaction is to turn around and begin to explore the other way.